So hi everyone, thanks for having me here. Excuse whatever coughing interrupts me as I go here. I've got a cough drop on reserve if need be, so we should be okay. And excuse also the photo here. This should be the most intense photo that I'm showing you here. And I start with this in part because it elicits reactions in people. You see something like this, and the immediate question for a lot of people is, why would someone do this? What's going on here? And that's a common question that people ask when they see religious action that people undertake. So just as a point of comparison here, we could ask similar questions. What's going on with the construction of the Sagrada Familia, which is paid for by donations of many people who attend? Why are these Buddhists throwing money into the air and feeding people who are deceased? Why are these Jain monks disavowing any possessions whatsoever so that every meal that they eat is donated to them from others? Why are these men jumping into a freezing cold water, right? The broader question here is if you're one of those people who wants to start from a sort of rational actor perspective, how can we explain religion? How can we explain these acts that people do in the name of religion? Certainly where I work in South India, there are a lot of acts as well that could raise those sorts of questions for people. So this is a woman, if you can make that out, she's carrying a burning fire pot through a procession. Okay, that's the worst photo, I promise. This man here is suspended from these hooks that are piercing the dermis of his back. He's hanging from a crane that's swinging him up and down through a procession. These women have just gone on a pilgrimage to a temple that's many hundreds of miles away from where they live. And this young girl on her way home from school stopped at the temple and became possessed. So again, where I work as well, we've got acts that sort of raise questions about what religion is and why people engage in these acts. Now, for a number of scholars, these acts that people do in the name of religion aren't something that demand explanation. Rather, they're part of the explanation for the continued salience and potency of religion today. And I'm going to walk you through the argument that they make. They draw on signaling theory, which is something to do with how we manage to communicate. So basically, they've got a nested argument here, and it starts with questions of cooperation. Conveying something about your religiosity, about the depth of your devotion, is something that's relatively hard to do. You may not even know the depth of your own devotion. But when you see people undertake acts in the name of religion, in the name of their faith, you can have some confidence in it, right? Only those people who truly believe are going to be willing to undertake these acts, are going to be willing to walk across a bed of hot coals or whatever the act might be. So these acts are seen as giving some insight into the underlying character of individuals, into their commitment both to the religion and to the religious group. Now, because we can have some confidence in the nature of people who are undertaking these acts, the argument then goes that that helps us to build trust. If you've got some confidence in another person's motivations and their underlying quality, you can establish these trusting, cooperative relationships that are otherwise somewhat hard to accomplish for fear of someone cheating you or being selfish and whatever else, right? Further then, these aren't just sort of dyadic relationships that are being formed up, but what we have is the emergence of a community. We've got a trusting community that's cohesive, that's cooperative. We've got these relationships that are being fostered between people who worship together, and it's going to have these emergent effects. We're going to be able to, at the end, say that we have something we could call a religious community, something that Durkheim would call a congregation. So there's this nested set of contentions here that out of these acts that people are undertaking, especially those acts that are most demanding, we eventually have the emergence of the religious community that's able to accomplish all of these things, able to, overcome all of the sort of trials of collective action and the rest. Now, what I've done in my own work is try to trace out and test those steps of that argument there. So I'm going to be looking at the religious acts that people undertake, what people perceive about a person given those acts, how that impacts the relationships that they're able to form up with one another, and whether or not at a collective level we can see some signature of those relationships and those trusting positions that people are able to achieve through, among other things, their religious action. Now, at the end of the talk, so I'm going to try to sort of take you quickly through those steps. At the end of the talk, I'm going to complicate it a little bit by talking about people's ability to undertake these acts and how their structural position, their social capital, influences the type of ritual action that they're able to undertake. So a little preview. Now, before I get into it, I want to just drive one point home, which is that when we talk about religion in the U.S., if we talk about the community that emerges through people who worship together, the image that might come to your mind is people who go to a Sunday service together, afterwards maybe stick around and have tea with one another, and isn't it nice? They feel warm and fuzzy, having had a nice conversation with their neighbors after Sunday service. That is not the type of relationship that I'm talking about here. I'm talking about relationships that are really fundamental to people's livelihood. And I'm going to illustrate that with just one point, which is the custom of moi, where I work. When you have a function, a religious function, say it's a marriage or a coming of age ceremony or first communion, something like that, when you attend it, at the entrance there will be a man sitting at a desk with a little notebook. And when you go in, you will hand that person a few hundred rupees, so maybe like $5 to $10, something like that. Your name will be written down, how much you've given will be written down. Imagine every guest who is coming to the function is doing this so that by the end of the event, the people who have organized it literally have a suitcase full of money. They have a suitcase full of cash. This is in a place where people don't usually have bank accounts. So your ability to get money, which will cover not only the expenses of the function that you had, but also will help you rebuild your home, buy a vehicle, do the major things that fuel your livelihood, comes from your relationships with other people. So I'm not talking about just the sort of emotive relationships between individuals. I'm talking about the ways in which your relationships with one another are really fundamental to your livelihood. And so these matter. If we're able to show that the nature of your religious practice influences your relationship with others, that's not ephemeral. That's not something that we can just say, isn't that nice? That matters to your ability to get by in life. So, having established all that, let me describe for you some of the data that I'm drawing upon. So I spent 20 months doing field work just about there in 2 villages in the southern state of Tamil Nadu. They're located just next to each other, as you can tell from these images. There's agriculture that's happening there. It's paddy rice is mostly what's grown there. That's if the water actually appears. And for the rest of the year, people are mostly engaging in sort of wage labor and work like that, whether it's construction work or making coal, that sort of thing. The villages each have about 300 families. They've got a mix of caste groups and a mix of religious groups as well. So there are Catholics, Protestants, and Hindus in the 2 villages that I'm working in. Now, when it comes to religious practice, I've got a few different measures of all of the villagers' religiosity. So one of the main things that people do is public ritual acts. So they'll visit a temple or a church and undertake what are, mostly what they'll do is undertake or really fulfill vows. So a vow is essentially a bargain that you've made with the deity. I really want my talk here to go well, so beforehand, I asked the divine for help doing that. If I don't screw up here entirely, afterwards I will fulfill the promise that I made before, which is that for the next 3 years at the festival, I will walk across the bed of hot coals. I will do something where I get to say that as out of gratitude for the help you've granted me, here's what we will do. So that can take a number of different forms. So this man here was having trouble conceiving a child. Obviously, that child has now been conceived because he's carrying the child as well as an image of a child which he is carrying through on a procession as he promised to do, right? So that's a pretty clear I did this, you helped me, now I'm gonna fulfill it. But it can take any range. So this is a Catholic man who's getting his hair tonsured. He also just sacrificed a goat. So Catholics are doing these acts as well. And they can sort of range in costliness and intensity of the acts being done. So these two people are carrying pots of milk on their head, which will get poured over the image of the god. And that man on there on the right has had his body pierced with 101 spears. So we've got a range of acts that people undertake. The request and the act are your own volition. So you get to choose the sort of intensity of what you're doing. So to account for that, and if anybody wants to ask me about this, I'm happy to talk about it more. I have not just a sort of a tally of the acts that that each adult resident undertakes. I've sort of weighted it by the monetary cost, the difficulty, and the pain entailed in undertaking the acts. Because we obviously cannot see getting your hair tonsured and piercing your body with 101 spears as equivalent, right? So I've got this information on the public ritual acts that people are undertaking. Then I also have information on just those people who each week are attending a church or a temple, just going on their own and taking part in that more regular, recurrent, more subtle but consistent ritual act. And then a relatively small number of people, but relatively vocal as well, get possessed on a somewhat regular basis. Possession it takes a few different forms, but basically it's the god entering your body and taking over. Sometimes the god will speak through you, but most often it's just sort of the raw energy of the god courses through your body, and you sort of, there's a stand, you know when someone's possessed, know it when you see it, sort of thing. So this is the information that I have on the religious practice that people undertake. Now to get to something about their social position, their standing. I did a survey with all of the adult residents in the two villages that I worked in, and it had two parts. First, it asked people to identify, okay, who in the village do you think is especially hardworking? Who do you think is especially generous? Who has a lot of ritual knowledge and can carry out ritual events? So a variety of traits that are sort of desirable in one sense or another. I'll talk about this for a second later, but to get some information on how a person's reputation changes in light of their ritual practice, I asked these questions again of people in the immediate aftermath of the major festival that happens in one of the villages that I worked in. The second half of the survey had me asking people about who you go to for support, and a variety of types of support. So the canonical, who do you discuss important matters with? But then also, okay, let's say you need some cash for the bus. Who do you go and get 10 rupees from? Okay, what about a sizable loan? Who do you enjoy just spending time talking with? Who do you go to for advice? Who do you have run errands for you? A variety of different types of support that give me a sense of the resources that people have to draw upon in their lives. Now, out of this, I can create a network of the two villages here. So obviously, we've got one of the villages here, one there. You know, they're neighboring, so not surprisingly, there are some ties that span them. This is a big mess. I mean, it's got 4,000 people and 20,000 edges. So let me reduce it down to you to something a little bit more salient. Here's the first village that I worked in. Nodes here are colored by caste, and they're sized by eigenvector centrality, which sociologists often say is a reasonable proxy for social capital. There's no spatial information here. The location of these nodes is determined solely by the ties connecting them. So you can see we've already got a lot of structure here. You might be wondering, what's this blue cluster at the top? Those are the Dalits, the untouchables, the scheduled castes in the two villages here. Pay attention, moving from this village to the next village, where the Dalits are the numerical majority in the village. So they are clearly in a very different position. These are two different hamlets that are occupied by one particular caste group. So again, the structure here is just emerging out of the nature of relationships between individuals. Oh, and I should say too, it's a directed network and it's a weighted network. So this is this person asking that person for support, that person asking this person for support, so we can look at reciprocity. And the thickness of the line there is determined by the number of types of support that they rely on that person for, right? So a lot for me to work with, obviously. Enough of the background, though. Let me actually get to what we can do with all of this. So first, how is religious practice used to discern information about your peers? What can you determine about a person? What can you discern about a person given the nature of their religious practice? How does your religious practice shape your reputation? Now, following from that literature that I very briefly cited before, we might expect that people who are more involved in the religious life of the village are going to be seen certainly as more devout, but also holding this sort of suite of prosocial traits. If they're demonstrating commitment to not only the religious tenets, but also the community and what it upholds, we should see some relationships there as well. So this is a generalized linear mixed model with negative binomial distribution and zero inflation, but in any case, what you can see here is that each measure of religiosity here is positively correlated, significantly positively correlated with first here, just being seen as devout. So I'm only looking at devotion here. Let me make this a little bit more intelligible for you here by running through some examples. So if a sort of middle-aged woman of the Agamudier caste undertakes no ritual action, she's still predicted to get nominated just about once for being, someone will say, yes, I think this woman is devout, okay? So I'm not perfectly capturing a person's reputation for devotion. That's fine. Okay. Now, if this woman undertakes the average ritual action that's undertaken, which could be something like in one festival carrying a pot of milk on your head and pouring that over the deity, and another carrying this mulepari, these sprouts on your head, she's getting about one more nomination. Okay, so we're getting a little bit closer there. If this woman gets possessed, almost 5 people are going to say that they think she's devout. If a woman every week is going and attending a worship at a church or at a temple, again, she's getting nominated about twice. But of course, most people don't do only one religious action. So what if someone both gets possessed and worships regularly? About 7 people are going to say that they think she's devout. If on top of that, people are doing additional ritual acts, something small like getting your hair tonsured, relatively minor bump. If you do a bigger act like fire walking, yet more people are going to say that you're devout, and people could do multiple acts as well. So what we have here at the end is a woman who is worshiping regularly, getting possessed, doing a number of ritual acts, is having almost 15 people naming her as being devout. Right? So we've got a meaningful relationship here then. Yes, we are indeed finding that people who are more involved in the religious life of the village, undertaking multiple types of religious action, are more recognized for being devout. Okay, now it's not particularly surprising that people who do more religious stuff are seen as more religious. What's going to be more interesting is to see what this has to do with those other measures of reputational standing that I had. So what do we see there? Well, we see a number of significant relationships here as well. If you worship regularly, or if you, excuse me, do greater and costlier ritual action, you are also seen as more hardworking, as giving good advice, as being generous, as having good character, and as having ritual knowledge. So again, we do indeed see that there's these suite of qualities that are following with you. Appropriately, only public ritual acts and those greater, more dramatic ones that entail physical risk, like fire walking and spears and things like that, only that gets you recognition for being physically strong, which makes some sense here. Possession here gets you just about nothing. Possession has you less likely to be seen as giving good advice here. And the one caveat that I should put to this, at least, is that all of these are being included in the same model together. If I include only possession, it has a positive relationship for a lot of these. And no one just gets possessed. You get possessed and you do other ritual actions. So essentially that negative relationship there to some degree ends up getting washed out. So these are all long-term relationships. Over the course of the year, how does your ritual action influence your reputational standing? I mentioned very briefly that I also asked these questions in the immediate aftermath of one of the big festivals in the villages where I work, where people do fire walking, piercing their cheeks with spears, carrying that fire pot around acts like that. So how can we see if someone's reputation changes in a more immediate sense in light of the religious actions that they're undertaking? And there too, we see that you are getting a boost in terms of being seen as devout, but also being seen as strong, giving good advice, and having good character. So we don't only have this long-term correlation, we also have these, this short-term, something closer to more causal relationship that we can identify as well. So to summarize quickly, yes, we do indeed find that people who are more involved in the religious life of the village have an improved reputational standing across a number of qualities. So not only for being seen as devout, but also for having this suite of sort of prosocial traits. What I would like to emphasize here that may not have been so clear from what I was showing before is that this doesn't only hold for those big dramatic acts that call our attention, but also for that more subtle but more consistent act of just going to a temple or a church each week. And the benefits are sometimes somewhat comparable. And we've got both this long-term relationship and this more immediate, something closer to causal signature as well. Okay, so yes, we can show that villagers are indeed attending to the religious action of others, are using it to discern something of their nature. They're reading something into their peers about it. What would be more interesting than to just say your reputation is being shaped by your action would be to see if your actual relationships with your peers are altered in light of this. If I see a person as more generous, as of better character, am I more likely to rely on that person for support? Am I more likely to see that person as the person that I'm going to be going to when I need some help? Yeah, Dan?
Just a clarification question about the previous data before we move on. Were those nominations by everyone, or were they exclusively co-congregants?
No, that's, I especially like that people are attending to the religious action of villagers who are not within their same religious denomination. So this is holding across religious groups. The Catholics know what the Hindus are doing and vice versa. Yeah. Yeah, and certainly give credence to it, I should say. Okay, so now do we actually see, what we want to look at now is, okay, my perception of this person has changed. Is my relationship with that person going to change as well? So we might predict here, again, people more involved in the religious life of the village are going to sort of preferentially be the person that people go to for support. So this is with an exponential random graph model, which, again, I can attempt to explain to people if anyone cares about social network analysis. But here, again, all significant relationships, though now we see that possession actually has a negative relationship. So let me try to break this out for you again. These are the odds ratios here. So what this is showing is that a person is significantly more likely to go to name someone as a person they go to for support if they worship regularly, or if they undertake a greater number of costly ritual acts, and less likely to go to them if they get possessed. And nicely, this holds across all of those different aspects of support that I have. So this holds for going to someone for monetary support, for emotional support, for guidance. Regardless, you are more likely to go to a person if they're more involved in the ritual action of the village. Now, this might give you an image of religious people just being burdened with requests for help from others. But if we look at the reciprocal relationships, we can see that particularly for those who worship regularly, they're more likely to have reciprocal relationships with other people. So they're also better able to get support themselves. So it's not just a question of people getting asked for assistance. You're also better able to access support yourself. Yeah, Jonathan?
Question about possession. What's so costly about possession? It doesn't really signal cost. It just maybe they don't even need the possession.
So yeah, possession, I would say that it sometimes is socially costly rather than physically costly or anything else like that. It's a little fraught. So people are very skeptical of possession for a number of different reasons. So some people doubt whether or not it's actually real. Some people might believe that the person is possessed, but might be unsure whether it's a deity possessing them or a pei, which is sort of like a ghost. So you may agree that someone is possessed, but you're unclear by whom. And if it's an undesirable, being, then it's certainly risky. Generally, possession there's many interesting things that have been written about this, but the general view of possession where I work is that in some sense it's desirable. You are demonstrating that you are a worthy vehicle for the divine. For the divine to enter you, you have to be, of a certain, your devotion, your bhakti, your love for the deity has to be pretty substantial. That being said, it layers on to social categories in ways that complicate things a little bit here. So it's more often women, and especially lower caste and lower class women, who are getting possessed. So some of what's getting read into this action here is partially something about, even though in these I'm controlling for the effect of gender and caste and the rest, still that sort of valuation of who it is, the category of person that gets possessed, has some sort of signature here.
These are not valued predictors of caste.
They are, but because of the sort of collinearity of this stuff here, I might not be able to fully account for it. The other thing about possession is that if we're taking a signaling perspective here, if we're saying that I'm learning something about you because of the ritual action you're undertaking, when you're possessed, you are no longer the salient individual. It is the God who has control of your body. So how can I learn something about you when you're possessed? I can learn something about the God, perhaps, but not so much about you. So it may just be that there isn't very much relevant information that you can get about a person through this act. So, okay. So just to summarize this second section here then, this reputation for prosociality that we're seeing with religious individuals has some truth to it. People are more likely to go to a person for support if they're undertaking these acts. This holds both for those intense, dramatic acts of devotion and that more consistent act, that more subtle act of just worshiping regularly. And religious individuals, especially those who worship regularly, are more able to call upon support themselves. So you can see some sort of social return to this, if you want to call it that. And again, that's especially for this more subtle act, not for those big, aggrandizing, dramatic acts that we might otherwise be sort of drawn to study. Okay, I'm going to try to get through this next section somewhat quickly so I can get to the nice caveats at the end. Now, central to the work on religion, to ritual theory, is this idea that religion brings people together. For Durkheim, it's collective effervescence. For Victor Turner, it's communitas, this idea that through ritual actions, especially ones that are more sort of aversive, people are bonded together. So, despite being this sort of canonical idea of religious action, we don't actually have all that much evidence for that sort of condensation of community. Partially that's because we often presume that religious group already exists. Here in the setting where I'm working, there isn't the equivalent of a Hindu congregation. So we can look more properly to see if we actually see those bonds being fostered between individuals. What I'm going to talk about today is just at the sort of interpersonal level here. Do we actually see that collective worship, that co-participation, especially in intense ritual actions, the fire walking, the piercings, things like that, increases the likelihood of a supportive tie between individuals? Do we see that aversive actions or ritual actions actually bond people together? So this is looking just at the festival in one of the villages where I worked, where many people undertake these acts. Some of them villages referred to as sort of like big vows, which are things like fire walking and piercing your cheek with a spear. And some are sort of more normal, sadhana nitikanan, which is just pot of milk, something like that. So that's the sort of dichotomy that I'm drawing here. What we see, basically, is that people who undertake the same sorts of ritual action in the festival, meaning people who are undertaking rituals together at the festival, whether it's both sort of big acts like firewalking or the more sort of normal act, it's unfortunate terminology, but there it is, like milk pots and things like that, are indeed more likely to have a relationship between the individual. So again, to break that out, odds ratios as before, people who undertake big acts together and people who undertake normal acts together are more likely to have a relationship. If we break that out by the different types of support, it's a little messier, but still we can generally see that people who are partaking in the festival together are more likely to have a relationship. And we can see that there are some sort of intuitive directions here as well, so that people who are doing a normal act are more likely to go to someone who's done a big act for financial support, which sort of makes sense because those acts are actually more monetarily costly. So you might be able to use this as some sort of information about the wealth and standing of that person. But generally, we do indeed see that people who worship together more likely to have a relationship. Now, what about people who aren't partaking in the festival together, but are just worshiping together each week at a church or at a temple? Here again, we see an increased likelihood of a tie between individuals. So Hindus who attend the monthly worship at this one festival in the village are more likely to have a tie, and Catholics who worship together each Sunday also more likely to have a tie. And especially for the Hindus, this holds across all of the different types of support that I have. For the Catholics here, it's a little bit less, still significant relationships. Part of the reason it's less here is that the Catholics are all of one particular caste group. Many of them are related. So they're already drawn together in this dense web of relationships. Whereas for the Hindus, you've got very disparate caste groups living in different neighborhoods of the village for whom this is one of the few spaces in which they're actually coming together. So it makes sense that the worship together would have a greater impact on the likelihood of their relationship with one another.
Could this also be like the network pre-existent and their social influence?
Definitely. That is the caveat that I'm about to say here, is that the causal arrow here is definitely going both directions. You could completely imagine that you going to a worship is going to be influenced by the fact that your neighbors and friends do, and then the sociality that happens in that space will further feedback. So yes, definitely. So we can show that collective worship does indeed increase the likelihood of a relationship between co-participants. And this holds both for those more intense ritual spaces, as well as the more recurrent, these are the terms of mostly Harvey Whitehouse, but take from them what you will, the more recurrent but consistent act of just attending a temple or a church together, church worship together each week. This is holding for Christians as well as Hindus. And what I haven't reported here in questions of questions of time is what I've been talking about so far has just been at the interpersonal level. But if you look at the overall network level, and if you just look at the sort of the subgraph of people who worship together, at that structural level, relationships are more dense. So there are more people who have connections with one another, and they're more reciprocal. So again, we can see something that is akin to essentially the emergence of a religious community that's being dictated by the shared practice here. And the causal arrow here surely goes both ways. So thank you for pointing that out. So hopefully what I've managed to do so far is convince you at least in some preliminary way, that we do indeed see some reasonable support for this nested series of hypotheses about how the nature of your religious action eventually shapes your relationships with your peers and the sort of structure of relationships at the village level here. And hopefully this gives us some idea of what religion does and alters the way in which you might ask a question about why someone is doing this in the first place. Yeah?
Question about maybe the asymmetry between somebody who is a more costly vow or
Mm-hmm.
act of devotion compared to someone who does the normal act of devotion. And look at the So people who do more costly behaviors, they would get more relationships, or the quality, what would be the specific benefit of being the one
Who does that big act?
if, if you're associated with people who just do normal things,
Mhm.
maybe it's just better to be normal. What do you get out of it
Yeah, what's the additional benefit?
compared to normal?
So, yeah, I'll hopefully get to this a little bit at the end. But I would generally say that, so you get a lot of the same social benefits for doing that more mundane, what I would call subtle signal of just attending the worships at a church or a temple each week. In terms of your interpersonal relationships with people, they're definitely fostered. What you get as well by doing those big dramatic acts is they are aggrandizing. They are a venue for what you might call status competition. They are a venue in which you can, the word in Tamil is perumai, which is sometimes translated as reputation, but it really means more literally bigness, and it's sort of social bigness. It's the extent to which your name is known and to which you are talked about. There's a way in which these more dramatic acts are certainly more attended to. That's what draws the crowd, and that's what draws the comments. So there's, for those people who are able to undertake them, there are certainly reputational benefits and status benefits that accrue. My sort of anecdotal evidence of this is the men in the village who are now most recognized as sort of influential, prominent men are the ones who about 15 years ago introduced these acts to the festival. So we've got this, you do get something distinctive there. Yeah?
So is the tendency towards these more dramatic acts, would you say it's driven more by traits or states of the individuals undertaking them?
I will get to that in this section, which I will turn my attention to now. Thanks for the lead-in. My own lead-in is to tell a bit of a story. Things don't always go as planned. Rituals can go awry. The most dramatic example of that is this woman who fell going across the bed of hot coals here. In the history of this festival, 2 women have fallen while going across the bed of hot coals. They both had to be hospitalized. They both had severe burns, what you would expect. The first woman to fall, the talk about it immediately afterwards was that her devotion was so great. The God fully took over her body. She had no control over her body, and so she fell. So it was actually seen in some sense as reflecting in a positive way on her devotion and her sort of character and being. The second woman to fall, this one I saw, she fell, crowd went silent. She was, what I should say here, this man runs in, carries her away. She's immediately taken to the hospital. She's in the hospital for a few days. She is fine. Know that. Not too long after the silence, people started talking, and the explanation given for this woman was very different. Same exact thing happened, explanation totally different. For her, the explanation is her husband is a drunk. Her husband is a drunk. The goddess is punishing her for the moral failings of her family. So same act, same misstep, read in totally different ways. Villagers are extremely attuned to this risk of falling. And what preoccupies them is not the physical risk. Your burns will heal. That's going to be fine. What people are concerned about is that social risk. They're concerned that the gossip that is going to spread will be what spread for that second woman. The reason I would say that the gossip was so much worse for this second woman has to do with their social capital, with their social position. So here are the 2 women. You could make a guess quickly about which was the woman for whom her fall was seen as evidence of devotion and the woman for whom it was seen as moral failing, right? This is the woman for whom people said, oh yes, this is because she's so devout. And that woman there over in the periphery is the one for whom they said it was the moral failing of her family. Villagers, again, know this. I mean, this makes some sort of intuitive sense. People are immediately, look at how many connections this woman has. This is a well-liked woman, very jovial. She likes to make dirty jokes. You know, everybody likes her. People are going to, that is going to influence the way in which her experience is perceived and in the way in which it's discussed. That woman over there, very different story. Very few people are going to come to her aid and are going to shape a narrative away from something like moral failing, right? Villagers are totally, excuse me, totally aware of that. One of the common laments, in fact, one of the common appeals to the divine is, there is no one for me. There is, you know, I have no one. You need to support me, Mariamma. You need to support me, Goddess, because there's no one here to do it for me. So it makes a difference as to where you are in that network, not only for the gossip that's going to spread about you, but for the consequences of that gossip. When that second woman was in the hospital, very few people went to go visit her. Usually when you go visit someone in the hospital, you give them a few hundred rupees to help cover the expenses of that hospital visit. She didn't have that. I mean, there was essentially social censure and ostracism that stemmed from her fall there, which, I mean, I would see as largely accidental, right? We've got the same act, totally different, playing out in totally different ways. Like I said, villagers are aware of this, and they seem to calibrate their undertaking of different ritual actions in light of their perceived social exposure. If you see yourself as being on the periphery there, if the consequence for gossip for you and social censure will be such that your livelihood is going to be impacted, you're much less likely to undertake those big dramatic acts that risk this sort of consequence. So let me try to illustrate that with these two plots here. What we have on the left here is essentially the intensity of the ritual action that people undertake. And on the right here, we have eigenvector centrality, which, as I said before, sociologists usually take as a proxy for social capital. It's how connected the people you are connected to are. I've divided it out into gender here, and it's across the age course. So we can see a few things here. Men are doing the most intensive, the most dramatic ritual acts when they're 18, when they're young, right? If you wanted, that's when the bravado is kicking in to some degree, right? It also is when their social capital is at its peak. Part of this I would explain by the fact that these villages are patrilocal. There's some classic anthropology speak for you there. These villages are patrilocal, so young men are surrounded by family and friends who they've been spending their whole time with. You can see the pattern for women is very different. And that's, again, in part because when you are an 18-year-old woman, you are either soon to be married or recently married into a village where you have your only connections are your husband and his family, right? As you get older, by the time you're about 40, your kids are getting a little bit older. You've established relationships over a good amount of time. You have built up relationships such that your social capital is higher. And correspondingly, we see that women peak in terms of the intensity of their ritual action at about the point when they are most socially secure, when their social capital is at its highest. So it seems to be that there is, when we talk about religious action, we can't only talk about a person's decision to undertake an act as being driven by the depth of their devotion. It also seems to be shaped by these extrinsic things, your social position, which are going to be a little bit harder to change. So this is talking about the overall intensity of the acts that people are taking place. Let me layer on one thing on top of this as well, which is that not only are the social risks different depending on where you are, but the social benefits differ as well. So in this chart here, We've got, again, eigenvector centrality on the horizontal there. And here, this is basically your reputational standing. This is the number of nominations that you have received for holding those different reputational qualities. And every dot here is someone who undertook a big act at the festival. Now, again, I said I asked those questions again immediately after the festival, so I get a sense of how a person's reputational standing shifted. So this is how people's reputation moves from before the festival to after the festival. So the terminus of that line is your reputation after. Obviously, those lines are not all of equal size. And I would say that we can see a general pattern here, which is that those people who have higher eigenvector centrality and higher reputational standing to start are getting a greater boost. They're getting greater recognition for their prominence, for undertaking what's effectively the same act. And the corollary is maybe more telling, that people who have lower social capital and lower reputational standing are gaining less for undertaking the same act. Yeah?
So in the case of that second woman, so she would be closer to this.
She's down here. Yeah.
Yeah. So it almost seems like the benefit is not worth the risk for them to undertake those
Exactly.
sorts of acts. So
Yep.
why would somebody undertake it?
Well, I mean, that is a very good question. And what I would say is that many people, there are many, many dots who are not on this plot at all. Most people who are down in this corner aren't bothering because the risk is too great and the benefit's too slim, right? So she is unusual for even having broached it in the first place. One of the women who is most recognized as devout in this village, before that second woman fell, she's recognized, like 50% of the people in the village named her as someone who's devout. Even she was saying, what would have happened if I were the one to have walked across the coals and fell? What would have happened to me? So that fear is present for everybody, and especially for those who are congregated in this corner of the distribution. Mm-hmm.
So have you done do you have any data on sort of characterizing the sorts of people? Or why?
Well, here we go. Here it is, now colored by gender. So the pattern isn't quite that clean, but I would say that there are more women down in this corner of the chart, and more telling. Here it is by the broad division within caste of untouchables, who are the orange, and well, this is between BC and SC. If you want to know the terminology, you can ask me about it afterwards. But essentially, those people who are at the bottom of the social hierarchy, whether it's women or Dalits, are nested in this corner of the distribution. I should say, if anybody's wondering about that point at the top right there, that man is already getting recognized by 10% of the people in the village. He's basically already topped out in terms of influence and prominence. So we've got sort of diminishing returns here to some degree. But yes, I'll just wrap this up here with a few points, which is basically that yes, an individual's exposure to gossip and to social censure seems to shape, in part, the likelihood of them undertaking these acts, especially those dramatic acts, which could stand to get you a lot, but in uneven ways. Importantly, the cost that is relevant here is not the physical risk. It is this perceived exposure to social ostracism that is usually not going to be realized, but is enough to shape people's behavior to have a really strong effect here. So when we talk about these dramatic acts, these eye-catching acts of firewalking and the rest, the cost that preoccupies people is not the monetary cost, it's not the physical pain endured, it's not any of that, it's that potential for there to be this social fallout if things happen to go wrong, which of course they rarely do. Only 2 women have ever fallen. Now, for those people who do choose to partake, there's this unfortunate feedback, which is that those people who are already better situated are gaining more, and those people who are less well situated are gaining relatively less for undertaking the same act. And because this layers onto these relatively immutable qualities like gender and caste, we have these unfortunate feedbacks that keep some people from even venturing to partake. So there's a wide literature on questions of status competition, which is almost inevitably undertaken by men, especially prominent men. And we somehow imagine that that the absence of women there says something about, I don't know, their lack of physical strength or something. But what I'm saying here is that this actually has to do with a layering up of sort of social disadvantages that make it much harder for people to break out. I mean, it's akin to a poverty trap, basically. Now, that's relatively depressing, so let me end here on one relatively happier note, which is that those social risks that are associated with dramatic acts, like firewalking and the rest, do not accompany the more subtle act of worshiping regularly. So to get back to the question earlier of why do people even bother to undertake the dramatic acts, well, for a lot of people, there isn't much point in doing it, because you can get a lot of the same benefits by doing just that more consistent act of worshiping regularly. That'll help you still advance in your social position and maybe eventually be able to do one of those larger acts. So if we want to look at the full suite of sort of social maneuverings that people are undertaking to better their position, we can't only focus on those big aggrandizing acts of status competition. We also need to look at these relatively more subtle but really socially crucial acts that may not immediately draw our attention or our questions, but are really the bread and butter of people's social lives. So I'll basically wrap it up there. Change the photo here to show, instead of the big dramatic act, that relatively subtle act of worshiping regularly. But hopefully you can still see how we can trace through the influence that people's religious action has on their social world and how it helps them get by in life in important ways. Now I'm happy to take whatever questions you might have for me, and thanks for listening to me drone on. Appreciate it. Mm-hmm.
It seems like if for those like less socially, people with lower social capital, it's a much bigger risk to take on these acts, then that should be if it's really a signaling story, and you're taking a more costly signal, so that should send a bigger signal, so it doesn't seem to square with it having less benefits. I mean, it should be a bigger signal for if it's more costly, so it should have more benefits. So why
So, yeah. I think for those people who are actually able to undertake it, you could see those reputational boosts are still pretty sizable. You're still getting something there. So I think it can make sense for people. It is a good question. I mean, that's certainly a question you could raise about possession as well. But I think you've got to see the sort of overarching suite of what people do. So the other point to make is that if you just do one of those big acts, if you just do a big act and it's not backed up by anything else, people are extremely skeptical of it. So the best example of that is one man did the Paravikavati, which is the act where you're piercing hooks through your back, you're suspended from a crane, and it's swung up and down. Obviously, pretty physically costly act and all the rest. That went pretty well for him until rumors started to spread that he had been drinking while he had been preparing for that act. You have to fast. I actually didn't mention this, excuse me. You have to fast for some amount of time before you can undertake these acts. And depending on the intensity of the act, it could be a few days or it could be a month. And fasting entails not only not eating a lunch, but also bathing 2 times a day, no sex, wearing certain clothes that mark you as someone who's fasting, not going to the house of people who are not. There's a whole litany of things that you have to do or not do, among which is definitely no drinking. So rumors started to spread that he had been drinking, and he was essentially run from the village. There was a meeting organized to talk about his position in the festival, and he was so upset by it that he left and worked in Mumbai for a few months and returned only later. So he was, I mean, the consequence for him, again, is complete social ostracism. Part of the reason that he faced such a dire consequence for that was because he only did the big act. If you do a big act and it's not backed up by many smaller subtle acts, people are going to see it as being undertaken for those aggrandizing purposes. You just want people to talk about you. He actually told me once that he wanted people to turn and look at him. So he was seen as having done it for selfish reasons, for ones that are totally against the suite of qualities that are supposed to be in evidence for undertaking that act. And so he faced some serious consequences for it. So to some degree, those people who are doing the big acts are only able to see those benefits because they're also doing the small ones. Brooke, yeah.
I'm wondering if I'm thinking about this as a signaling argument, I'm thinking about the difference in the amount of boost that you get if you're sort of lower caste versus a more upper caste. If the audience really matters here. So if you're lower caste, so whose attention are you trying to get? Who's paying attention to you, right? And if you're an upper caste person, then maybe everybody is watching. Everybody might want to ask you for social support. But if you're a lower caste person, then it's unlikely that all these people who are have more resources than you do are going to be looking to you as a potential source of support. And so if you look at just within caste, the boost that they get or something, if that, like, it's a smaller boost, but actually it's
Relatively greater.
Relatively maybe the same or greater.
Yeah, I should look at that more closely, but anecdotally, from preliminary looks that I've done, I think that definitely holds. And that's actually, you've hit upon the distinction that I draw between what I'm calling dramatic signals and subtle signals. And the distinction really is question of audience. For those dramatic signals, everybody is attending to it. Everybody is watching. So there is that potential for it to be seen as being driven by the desire to have people watch it, to have it be seen as actually aggrandizing. For these more subtle signals, for just going and visiting a temple on a Tuesday or a Friday, or going to a church on a Saturday, you're not supposed to care if anyone's paying attention. It should not matter. And in fact, people do know. People know who goes to church. They know who goes to temple. But the fact that it is supposed to be driven by something intrinsic, by something just your personal desire to go and do this act, rather than the eye of the entire village on you, is what seems to bring the skepticism to those bigger acts.
Sorry, just one brief follow-up. So I wonder if you're lower caste and you do one of these more public acts, if the upper caste people are more likely to give you what you ask for if you go to them asking for support. Because
that's
you think you're self-aware.
Yeah. So there's generally a weaker signal of support received than support given, because the way I asked the survey, people almost always named just about the same number of people. Like everybody named about 30 people as someone that they went to for support. So the distribution is essentially tiny for support received rather than support given. But ethnographically, I think that's probably what's going on there. And I think that's part of the other point, too, is that you've got to be paying attention to who is the relevant audience here. And for a lot of these things, it might be a much closer social circle than broadcast to the entire village. Yeah, Dan?
So your remarks about the emic interpretations of the acts in terms of being true signs of devotion or self-aggrandizing, political strategizing, seems to me potentially, and maybe these would be difficult data to get, but to shed light on what you were presenting as a bidirectional causality, that social capital is really influencing the payoffs for the acts of devotion. It could be that social capital is the accretion that you see now of a
Many.
long history
Yep.
of acts of devotion in the past. And so somebody who has a history of public acts of signals, right?
Yeah, you're basically saying someone could move up that ladder. Yeah.
With a cross-sectional design, you don't capture the context that your participants actually are using
Yep.
in making their assessments.
Yep. Yeah, that's why I would love, well, I will be going back to get additional information on, I should be gathering more social support network data and reputational data in the coming years. So I should be able to see if we can actually look across time to see if someone's position changes. Yeah, the only evidence that I have now is the anecdotal one that I mentioned before, which is that the people who are most influential in the village now are the ones who first started doing these rituals 15 years ago. So there is some evidence that, you could essentially, that could be some of the explanation for those few people, the SE individuals who are down in this corner who are still undertaking these acts. First of all, they have some of the highest, they are relatively high in terms of eigenvector centrality, in terms of social capital compared to all of the SE individuals. So they're already slightly better situated. And, that's pretty good right there. So you could imagine someone sort of slowly building up.
Yeah, so the question that was asked earlier, why do it if the payouts are low, is just because these people have a long time horizon.
Yeah.
They're planning for the future, and what you're seeing is the early stages of their political career.
Exactly.
And, in terms of situating the work in the larger signaling literature, I think it's important to distinguish that kind of repeated signaling interaction from costly signaling arguments that are made with regard to barriers to entry,
Yep.
right? So if there's some initiation ritual that you have to undergo that involves extensive body modification or long-term privation or something like that, there the intrinsic costs of the signal probably do explain its efficacy to a greater extent because there's a barrier to entry, and only
Right.
someone who's willing and able to pay those costs
Will be, yeah.
is then going to enter the group and presumably not then defect, right, by virtue of the high costs of the barrier.
Yeah, definitely.
But if in fact these are not those sort of exclusive doorways through which individuals pass to gain access to cooperation, but rather are part of a long-running milieu of social interactions, then the high cost of any one act is going to be less revealing, and you have to situate it within the context of the history.
Exactly. And that's why I think we can see the sizable impact of these, just going and attending a worship each week is not particularly costly. It is costly if you are doing that consistently every week across the course of your life. So I think the reason we can see the signature here so clearly is because people are taking that long view and are using all of the information at their disposal, the ritual act that someone did last week, as well as what they did 20 years prior to shape their perception of someone.
So I want to ask a bit more about the people that sort of at the corner and why they do this act. Do you know anything about how the decision is made to partake in the ritual? So is it like an individual decision, anyone can do it, or is it more like pushed by community members, or you have to be certain,
Yeah. So for these vows, it's usually completely individually driven. And again, because they can sometimes be seen as being undertaken for selfish reasons, I would say because of that in part, the actual reason is specifically obscured. So when you ask somebody why they did these acts, they'll say, it's just a vow. They usually will not give you any information. They will not say, I was having trouble conceiving a child. Look, I have a child now. I'm doing this because of that. They will not tell you why they're doing it, in part because you've made the vow quite a long time ago. If the God doesn't come through for you, you don't want to have been telling people that you made this request from the God, right? Because if the God doesn't come through, that means that it's on you. It's some failing on your part. So when you first make the vow, you don't tell anyone. And then when it comes time to complete it, you don't want to be going around saying, look how wonderful my life is. I just managed to ace this exam, and now I'm doing this because my life is great and yours sucks. So people, and it's twofold. You don't want to gloat about your success, and you don't also want to call attention to what had been a failure. For you to need to call upon the divine means that you are having trouble accomplishing it on your own. So for those reasons, people don't tell you anything about it. That doesn't mean that people aren't constantly trying to infer what is likely the reason for someone having done it. But you don't tell. So I mentioned that word paromai, which is bigness. If you start talking up your own reason for doing the vow, that's called tar paromai, which is, instead of being people talking about you, it's you talking about yourself, and it's braggadocio, basically. So you want to not be doing any of that. So for that reason, I don't have good information about why people did it, beyond the sort of general patterns and justifications that people give.
But nobody's being groomed.
No, I mean, sometimes little kids will do this. Like if a kid had a childhood illness or something like that, then when they have overcome that, their parents might encourage them to do this. But almost exclusively, beyond those few exceptions, it is you deciding to do it. And in fact, you may well have your family members saying, you do not need to do fire walking. You can just carry that pot of milk. A pot of milk is fine. Why do you need to go do this big, risky act? Yeah. Yeah.
So I just want to talk a little bit about the context and the setting where you did this study. Of course, this is a rural area where
Yep.
the level and the density of social networks is very high, and from one person to another, if you look at the works done by Evans Pritchard or Turner, they're very similar. So if you take this approach and you try to apply it to an urban setting where the networks are somehow much more limited, what can an approach like this add to a study done in Paris, for instance, or Delhi, or some big urban context?
So Dimitri Jagelatis is a psychologist, anthropologist at the University of Connecticut who looks at almost the exact same ritual setting on the island of Mauritius, which has a big Tamil population. Dimitri Jagelatis, I doubt I'm saying that's right, XYG, University of Connecticut. So that is a setting where, so I'm looking at rituals that are primarily happening in the village, where people in the village are watching it. People are going elsewhere, but you usually know who's doing what. He works at what is a pilgrimage destination, where there's a festival each year where people are coming and watching, partaking in and watching others undertake acts where they will not know the people around them. He has not looked so much at the perception of individuals, but he has shown that they are more generous in terms of they make larger donations to the temple. There are a few other things. But I think basically the signal content, or what you can reliably get from the signal, is going to have to change, because you don't, like Dan was saying, when you don't have a lifetime of observing someone, the credence you can give to any one act is going to be pretty different. That being said, these acts are not, have not been going on for time immemorial in these villages. They're actually attempts at emulating larger urban centers where these acts are also undertaken. So this festival has been going on for quite some time, but the fire walking, the piercings, things like that have only been introduced in the past 15 years because they're happening at bigger, more urban temples. So you could say that the reason that they are more common at these bigger urban centers is because, returning to a sort of more simple signaling argument, those are the ones for which you can actually more confidently demonstrate something about your devotion, if that's the only information you have to go off of, just that one-off act. Yeah, Brooke.
I'm going to be the behavioral ecologist. So have you looked at reproductive success, especially for these young men?
Yeah. So again, because I don't have long-term temporal data, I haven't been able to look at that yet. It would be interesting to get.
So you don't have histories of
No.
people, you have just a cross-section of
Yeah, I have histories of that probably have a few holes in them of the big acts for the past few years, but the sample size is too small to really do anything with. That being said, what I also have is 20 months of daily economic data for 100 households in the two villages that give me information on In the household, what were your expenses for today? What were they for? What work did the adult members do? What were the wages they got for the work? And what portion of that wage was actually given to the household? A good number of men pocket a little bit for drink. So you've got to sort of take that into account. What I will soon be doing when I finally have the time to analyze this is basically to look to see if, okay, so I've been able to show in part that religious practice, arrow, social capital, okay, well then what do you do with social capital? The idea is that you're going to be able to transfer that into some other forms of capital, something about risk buffering, right? So do we see that people who have relatively higher social capital in terms of these network measures of centrality are better able to deal with a very fluctuating environment? So for 2 of the years that I was there was a drought, so people couldn't actually grow the paddy rice that they usually do. And fluctuating wage labor opportunities as well. So your ability to find work, to take that work and get a good wage for that work is presumably shaped by your social resources, by your social capital. So what I will be able to do is not get all the way to reproductive success, but at least to something closer to economic livelihood and your ability to get by in that more proximate sense, which certainly we are going to say, I would expect we're going to be able to see a stronger signature there than we might be able to between that sort of long-term diffuse effect between religious action some time ago and lifetime reproductive success.
You could also just add attractiveness to the list of qualities, like not necessarily physical attractiveness, but like how desirable is this person as a short-term or long-term person.
Yeah, I mean, maybe it's because I spend most of my time just gossiping with like 50-year-old women. When they see the young men doing this stuff, they're sort of like, yeah. So they'll use the English term ego, like, oh, they're just doing this for ego. And there's a Tamil term which is literally head weight, like you're big-headed, right? And that definitely follows around some of the young men who are doing these acts. Again, which gets back to that point of if you just do the big one-off act and it's not backed up by all these other demonstrations of devotion and commitment, you're going to get read as the ego-driven kid who just wants to show how strong he is, right? Yeah.
So a couple of points. One, in regard to just following up on that, I mean, so you might think, well, so why are those 19-year-old big-headed boys, doing what seems to be, a costly, dangerous, and unprofitable enterprise, right? Aren't they smart enough to understand that, surely they hear their mothers and aunts talking, right? Why do they do it anyway? And an alternative explanation is that's not their constituency, right?
Yeah.
The audience.
Yeah,
that they're
exactly.
appealing
That's
to
why I give the caveat of I'm spending my time talking with
Right,
50-year-old women. Yeah,
But it may not even be the same signal. So
Yeah,
that
yeah.
is, they're not trying to establish that they're reliable members of a cooperative
Mm-hmm.
community who can be counted on for mutualistic behavior and
Mm-hmm.
cooperative dilemmas. Instead, they may be trying to signal something about risk proneness, physical formidability, genetic quality.
Remember, strength is there's a significant relationship with strength. I completely agree, and I don't want to. I certainly see the signal content here as multiplex. There is not one unitary thing that is being conveyed through these acts. There are different messages that are coming out, and certainly can be directed at different audiences.
I
Yeah.
mean, one way of looking at that would be then to have assessments by your participants that are stratified by social category, including things like age and gender, right? And that have components in them, that are ecologically valid in the sense that those are the things that those participants care about.
Right.
So, I'm sure that a lot of 50-year-old women watching the X Games think that the motocross athletes are big-headed egotists, right? But all the 19-year-old dudes in
Yeah.
the audience
Yeah, I
are,
think it's excellent. Yeah.
just
So I can do that because I know who's doing the nominating, right? So I can look at how nominations vary by age, gender, whatever else you want to see.
Yeah.
And I think there are other interesting things to look at there as well. I mean, you asked a question earlier. Are these nominations happening across religious denominations? So you can look at. I should be able to quantify what amounts to the myopia of different groups, and the like. And my ethnographic sense of that is that SC individuals know a lot more about what's going on with the BC individuals than vice versa, things like that.
So related to that, and I mean that last point speaks to kind of what the affordances of the individual are my memory, particularly for South Asia, but also many places in the world, is that spirit possession is often the avenue employed by marginal individuals.
Yeah, you're talking about Obersekere. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
I mean, his case is
Yep.
his work is
Yep.
the clearest demonstration of that. But
Mhm.
that's a pattern that seems
Mhm.
to occur in lots of places,
Yep.
right?
Yep.
And in some ways, that signal, so you can see, gee, your spirit possession doesn't seem like an effective strategy within this social milieu. Why are people doing it? And you had explanations. You make explanations about, well, is it, the person or the deity that you're interacting with in that context? Is it really the deity, or is it, some other supernatural agent, and so on? But another alternative is that these signals are about establishing one's bona fides as a member of a mutualistic collective,
Mhm.
right?
Mhm.
And spirit possession isn't aimed at that at all.
Yep.
Instead, it's about extracting resources by way of placing demands on others, right? So
Yeah.
you wouldn't expect people who are known to engage in spirit possession to be nominated as, high status, reliable, the kind of person you go to for help, etc. Because by definition, they're the people who are pleading with others to assist
Yep.
them.
So two things on that front. Yes, I agree. The first, gosh, now I'm forgetting my two things. Well, the second, and I will then work on remembering the first, is that I briefly said that there are different types of possession. The type of possession that I'm talking about here is not, so what Obersekere and other psychological anthropologists have looked at is primarily one in which the god actually speaks through the person and they can voice demands. And they can, essentially it becomes a space in which you can force people who would otherwise not listen to you, is the explanation that's usually given. The possession that I'm talking about here is not of that form. This is people who are not usually having the god actually speak through them. It's a type of possession that is very short-lived, usually only about 30 seconds or something like that, that happens usually at the temple or during festivals, where just sort of like the raw Shakti, the raw energy of the goddess comes in, or God comes and courses through the person. So it being a space for, making demands on people doesn't quite hold for this setting. That being said, the first thing I was going to say, I have now remembered, is basically I don't think a signaling explanation works very well for possession. I think it has to be something closer to what you're talking about there, where for a number of reasons it just doesn't have much credence as this signal about the underlying character of the person. The motivation for it is going to be something else, and it may be something closer to what you're talking about, of a sort of a demand for attention and recognition. That it could almost be more of a political stance, where you don't care about what the consequences are, but it's more that you need to demonstrate this fervor. So, yes. Mm-hmm.
So I'm interested sort of in whether or not I'm like, it seems like there's an asymmetry in the degree to which regular participation in these more subtle acts actually profits you from the effects of risk. So when you're talking about those two instances of the women, well, so you have your guy who's not doing anything subtle, and then they call him out, run him out of town. And you have these two women who, you have these differences in their caste, but were they also both regularly attending?
They were.
Okay, so then, it seems like there are sort of functioning, as a function of caste, there are sort of differential effects of the regular worship in buffeting the consequences of the social risk taken in these big things. So do you have any ideas of what is driving that?
Well, I guess the first thing that I would say is that these two women are outliers to start, right? So we can't form, it's a nice illustration, but I can't form my whole argument about what happened to these two particular women. And again, these are very rare events. So again, it's just not usually going to be what you have happening there. I don't have information. The only thing where I can say this is the size of the boost you're going to get, I only have that for those dramatic acts. I don't have that. I don't have that temporal data for regular worship. So I can't actually directly speak to what the immediate causal benefits are going to be for that act. I guess what I would say is that it is more people are more able to do those subtle signals of worshiping regularly. It's essential for a lot of people because it may be the only avenue that they have open to them. And then for people who have other avenues towards prominence, and that can be outside of the religious sphere, it could be political positions or whatever else. For them as well, they also have to be, because you can't just do the one big thing, there's also value in doing those smaller acts. So I don't know if I've really answered your question here, but I would say there's sort of a universal benefit, an almost necessity of doing these more consistent, subtle acts. I'm looking particularly in the religious sphere, but you could imagine there are many other venues, especially in this small setting where everybody knows each other, where there are going to be different ways in which you can do that sort of minor social maneuvering. This just happens to be what I have data for. Any other questions?
Great.
All right. Thank you.